And then, oh yes, Dr. Scott, if you could record, that would be fantastic. If not, then I can find the record button. Okay, perfect. So again, welcome. This is San Jose State's LLD Student Association's Spring 22 Student Symposium. So we've got this as our agenda for today. We have, you can kind of glance through it. There's going to be a question session, Q&A session after each presenter, and then we've got a small break at 10:50 after our first two presenters. And we aim to conclude around 11:45 a.m. So first, I'd like to introduce the current president of LLDSA, which is Fong. Fong, if you want to say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Uh-oh, you're a little bit, try again.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fong Nguyen. I'm the president of LLDSA, as Stephanie mentioned. Thank you so much for coming. I'm at work right now, so I'll be in the chat if you need me. And yeah, I hope you like the symposium. We have 3, 4, 5 presenters today with varying topics on like TESOL, computational linguistics, and others. Okay, I'll pass it on to Stephanie.
Okay. Again, I'm the current secretary. Just I know that part probably got cut before the recording. So welcome everybody. And our presenters today are going to be Dylan, Ramzi, is that how you pronounce it? Ramzi, okay. And then Jazmine, and then our guest speakers are Dr. Scott Phillabaum and Dr. David Malinowski, who are from our LLD department. And if you'd like to follow along, I'm going to stop sharing so that our presenters can share their own slides. And then after each presentation is done, we'll have a brief question and answer session. And then after that, we'll move on to the next presenter, rinse, repeat. Okay. And Dylan, if you're ready, I will hand it over to you.
Can I say something real quick?
Sure.
I just wanted to echo what Charmaine had said earlier, thanking Stephanie and Fong and all the other members of the LLDSA for their hard work on this. I'm the faculty advisor, and it hasn't been easy as we come out of the pandemic to organize things like this and to get people involved, and they've done lots of wonderful things, not just this, but throughout the whole year. So I wanted to make sure that, that everybody heard that.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Okay, and now Dylan, I will stop sharing and you can take over.
Awesome. Okay, so can everybody hear me all right? I want to make sure because I was going to use my AirPods and they're not working, so I'm sad. But we got this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully it shares like my slides. Sometimes it just doesn't. So I'm going to make sure it shares things correctly. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this all right. So my project is basically about comparing and contrast of inclusivity in ESL education in various metropolitan areas across the United States. So this is a very big kind of term. So I kind of wanted to break it down a little bit into what it's basically the research project's aims are. So the first thing is basically increasing equity through both respectful and open gender expression conversations. This basically just means being able to talk about gender more freely in the classroom. I think that's a very important thing. I think it kind of helps aid a student's academic success if they're able to express themselves appropriately. Increase linguistic awareness of gender in language classroom. This is another really big one for me because it can be difficult to kind of like grasp the idea of gender in different languages sometimes, because sometimes it changes in terms of like grammatical gender, for instance. Gender can be different based on the language you're speaking, so it can be difficult to kind of translate. Help students cultivate a space to express awareness or to express themselves through language. Again, this kind of relates to one, but I really wanted to emphasize this space that a classroom can be in order to express yourself to your fullest extent through language. So not only just giving students the space to do that, but giving them the tools and the resources that they need in order to properly and appropriately do that. But yeah, and then finally, this got a little cut off from my little graphic, but increase overall awareness of gender in the multiple forms of expression it has. Again, this relates to two, but the multiple forms of expression, like I said, gender is a very big thing. It's very, you know, has a lot of stuff packed into it, so to speak. So kind of being able to express yourself in the multiple ways that gender can express itself really is really important to me, I feel, especially with a student's success. But yeah, so those are the aims. So these are like kind of like what kind of inspired me and made me want to do this research project, because I felt like those, at least from my experience, and what kind of inspired me to get into the project was that I felt that gender was a topic in language classrooms in general, but a lot of ESL where it just felt it didn't feel like it was being covered in the dimensions that it could be. For example, I felt, you know, non-binary terms are very like, I've seen them taught and I've seen them not taught. Like, to use someone's term like with a non-binary. So it's like stuff like that. Like, how are we going to implement that into the English language classroom? I feel like it's really important because we want to have, especially in something as globalized as, you know, language, like it's something that's so widespread. Like, I really think it's important to be equitable in that teaching, if that makes sense, just because when we have situations where people are learning language, it can be a very sensitive and personal thing, very intimate. So when we take that kind of identity away from them, in a way, we're taking away their like way to express themselves, which feels very wrong to me. So I've always wanted to, you know, promote this kind of idea of equitability in the gender, in the English language classroom specifically. But it goes to language classrooms in general too. You know, there's a lot of examples that I grab from language class, from French classes, from Spanish classes that relate to this, that are a good, you know, example of how you can implement gender, kind of a less narrow teaching of gender in the classroom, I want to say. Anyway, sorry. The data I collected, which is what I wanted to get into, is basically two steps. My PowerPoint got a little cut off there, but I'll explain it. Basically, it's a interview with an ESL teacher from the 5 metropolitan areas, which will be in the next slide. And it's basically just asking very open-ended questions. I wanted the questions to be very open-ended because I wanted to be able to, you know, just, I want to say like, get a feel for what even gender is, how a gender is even approached from that classroom. Because it's really important to kind of like let the, I wanted the ESL teacher to give me what they, you know, what they felt. So I was like, okay, I want these to be very open-ended. And then of course, this part that got cut off is the secondary sources that I'll be using, which are articles and stuff like that. I found a lot. It's interesting because I looked for some articles and I found a lot that were on other language learning, like gender in other language learning, like French and Spanish. English wasn't harder, but like, I don't know. I feel like I had a little bit of harder time, so I found that a little interesting. Anyway, so yeah, sorry, I get off topic a lot. Metro areas that were selected. I chose Bay Area, California for multiple reasons. First one is that I'm there, so I feel most comfortable getting resources from there. Two, it's, you know, English language learning is very popular in California. So I think it's very important to that aspect. However, I also chose, I tried to choose other places like San Antonio in Texas and Miami and New York City. I wanted to like try and like get like it's hard because I wanted to choose metropolitan areas because I wanted to have them all be at the same level. Like I didn't want to choose like Bay Area and then choose like somewhere in Wyoming because I feel like that wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be a fair comparison. So I wanted to stick with metros. But I was like, okay, which metropolitan areas? And I chose Miami because they have a different demographic and population than California. So does Minnesota. And I tried to do that because I really felt like getting a big net, so to speak, was really kind of detrimental to this study because I wanted to get kind of like America's viewpoint as a whole. But yeah, so the method of data analysis. So what will I be doing with these results, these interviews, these articles, resources, all this stuff? The first part will be a synthesis of the interview responses. Obviously, I'll be doing a compare and contrast across different metropolitan areas, along with the secondary sources collected. This is pretty self-explanatory because of the title, compare and contrast. So yeah, I'll be doing a compare and contrast. I will also, the second part is also proposing a response to the results that incorporates gender identities into the classroom. So obviously I'm not, I haven't like completely synthesized the results yet. So I'm still working on it, but the response to the results, basically what I mean by that is just, I want to be able to address this. Like if we have these inequities, how are we going to like respond to that? Like, how do we respond to, for example, if a ESL classroom in XYZ, you know, state doesn't talk about gender at all, and they just don't acknowledge non-binary terms, and a place in like XYZ state does, how are we going to address that inequity and that discrepancy? Because I feel like that's really important. So yeah, so basically proposing a response is the big thing. I want to be able to like have something like, I don't know, like tangible and like very like, I want to be able to be like, okay, this made a difference. So that's kind of what this part is to be like, okay, this is how we can kind of properly introduce more identities into the classroom. Because I feel, like I said, it's something that in recent years, I feel like it's been brought up a little bit more. I remember, for example, I had a French teacher, and she taught us non-binary terms, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because I was never taught that in my Spanish classes. I was just, that was never a thing, and I was never taught that in any other French classes. I was never taught that in, you know, English classes when I was, you know, in primary school. It was just, it feels like something that we haven't fully looked into yet, that I feel like would be very helpful and beneficial to us to better represent, you know, people. So that's, yeah, I kind of just talked about the significance, my bad. But yeah, this study will allow us to better understand the complexities of gender identity in the language classroom, specifically English language. I focused on ESL because for a multitude of reasons, honestly. One, because that's my main profession, I guess, is I want to be an ESL professor. So it's like, while I do teach Spanish and French and I love other languages, it's one that I felt most comfortable talking about. So that's why I chose it. But yeah, in turn, this will better help us represent the people as a whole in the classroom and ultimately in society. Again, I think language, this is the big takeaway, and I'll end on this because I think, okay, cool. So I'll end on this. My big thing and takeaway from this is that I feel as a language teacher, especially as an English language teacher, just because English has been so globalized over the years, it's been going everywhere. Like it's a lot more globalized. So it's so much more important that we are able to represent, you know, the people that speak it, people that are learning it. I feel if they're if they have different gender identities than the mainstream, quote unquote. I feel that should be represented, because if we're not representing, people in language, then what are we doing? So that has always been my big thing with it. But yeah, that's my whole thing. Sorry, I love this stuff, so I could go on and on and on about it. But yeah, I will. This is where okay, there we go. I will stop broadcasting. Yay, I know how to work Zoom. Okay, thank you. Any questions? I will mute myself. Thank you.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up.
Well, I have. So I'm kind of new about this gender identities topic. I relate my knowledge more about genres in writing and stuff like that. So would you mind giving me some examples about the gender identities other than she and he in the classroom that teachers should use in order to validate a student's identity?
Yeah, so that's the thing, is that like I really, and this gets into like the crux of what I discovered kind of, is it's really important to get your students' input and be like, hey, what are you comfortable with me referring to you as? Because sometimes, this is in my personal life, I've met people where they're like, I'm comfortable with letting you know. Some people, they're like, I want to be asked what my pronouns are, because it depends on the situation. Sometimes they're more comfortable referring to their, at birth gender, and sometimes they are more comfortable with referring to their gender that they prefer to. And there's, for example, there's he, him, there's she, her, there's they, which is, non-binary. There's, I'm like, I woke up a little bit ago, so I'm like trying to wake up. But it's hard, because it's like I refer to it more as like a spectrum, and it's mostly more like whatever the person refers to themselves as, because that's what it is all about. It's about identity, and it's about like what the person is most comfortable with as themselves. So that's what makes it really difficult, because it can't really be streamlined. And that's the big takeaway from my kind of, I guess, mantra of teaching, is that it's really hard to streamline teaching, right? It's really hard to streamline and kind of like make it so we can just refer to students by he or him or she or her. And it's hard to like ask like, okay, what are your pronouns? Like a student or a classroom of like 200 people, right? So it can be really difficult to kind of implement that personalized education in a big setting. However, I do believe that there's ways to overcome that. There could always be like a Google form, something simple like that, like what are your pronouns? But I really think that asking and kind of just starting this kind of dialogue of like, I don't know, just including non-binary people and people that don't fall into the he, him, and she, her, like kind of mainstream gender terms, because it's just, I feel like it's a demographic that we're just excluding, and it's something that I feel that they should be represented in, especially in language teaching, because it can be, like I said, so intimate and so personal.
So the thing is, I'm sorry, it's just, I mean, for example, right, if we are asking students, how should I, if the person has a female name or a male name, so still acknowledging that we should, according to your research, we should ask them, how should we refer to them? Is that right?
Yes.
I'm sorry, so just let me just complete my thought here. And then according to that, don't you think that when we ask, for example, I have a female name, right? And I know it might vary cross-culturally. But let's suppose I am Flavia. And then if my teacher asks me, hey, Flavia, how should I refer to you? Don't you think that this would be a kind of exposing the student? Like, he's going to have to say, hey, refer to me as this, refer to me as that. And the other students might realize that, I don't know. So that he might be different. I mean, do you know what I mean? I'm not sure if
Yeah, well,
I express myself well.
well, that's really the tricky conversation, is kind of like realizing when these conversations can be public and when they can be private. Because some people are more comfortable talking with the professor one-on-one, and that's very valid. And that, you know, some people aren't comfortable talking about it in public settings because they're not, you know, for whatever reason, and that's a completely valid kind of response to it. I do think that and again, I'm still ongoing to figure out what are the best ways to kind of implement this. So like, yeah, one way is to refer to their pronouns or like ask them like just head on. But again, that's one way of like many ways that I'm still looking at. But it's a really tricky conversation because like you said, you don't want to expose people because it's like that can be a very exposing thing. So you want to be able to be like, hey, I want to acknowledge you, but also make you feel safe. Because that might, while you ask them, it might, you know, acknowledge them, they might not feel safe. And on the other hand, if you don't acknowledge them, or if you don't like refer to them as their proper pronouns, you know, it's the opposite, where they might feel safe, but they might not feel acknowledged. So it's like finding that perfect balance of the two, I feel, is what I'm trying to do, and make sure that the student is just, you know, as comfortable as they can be, because that's what learning is all about. But yeah.
That's right. That's really tricky, man, because really, if we are acknowledging them, then we are acknowledging that they are different than we are. So that's the thing. I mean,
can I jump in
Yeah.
for the sake of discussion time? I know that Jazmine has
Yes.
had her hand raised for a while.
Yes, Jazmine has a question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Jazmine, nice to meet you all. So I was actually going to give a different comment, but then I also wanted to just touch upon this specific conversation that's going on right now. But I think also what Dylan's getting at with capturing identity and gendered identity in a second language is really important for us to think about how language is a living organism that's consistently changing, and it's due to you know, discourses that are going on right now, political discourses, cultural discourses that are ever shifting. And I think oftentimes second language learning, teaching, I taught English as a second language, Spanish as a second language. And I think oftentimes in that field, we treat language as this primordial thing that just has, it dropped from the sky, it's been ordained by God, and this is how it is. And that we can't switch it, we can't change it or anything like that, but we can. And so a technique that I've always wanted to use, especially when it came to the conversation on gender or race or anything like that, is what are people actually doing? What are discourses, terms that you are going to come across if you exist in a Spanish-speaking context, especially in a metropolitan area where we are having more discussions on gender exclusivity. So yeah, I think that's always been my goal, is just to actually have them see that, you know, you want to be able to communicate with actual people and not necessarily just books that don't, right? Things like that. And specifically to touch on this conversation based on the question that Flavia has asked, is you are correct in the sense that when you do ask students to, in front of everyone, what's your gender pronouns again? Sorry, you can be outing them in a way that's uncomfortable. And my advisor actually does some research on this specific thing, and just gave a talk at a conference recently about it. And this is a part of the process of trying to normalize us talking about gendered identity on a one-on-one level. So ideally in a classroom, it's, you know, you want your students to be talking to each other as well. And so when they're in small groups or in pairs or something like that, students should be able to feel comfortable saying, oh, what's your pronouns, Dylan? Sorry about that, or something like that. Also, there's a lot of anonymous ways that you can ask your students about this. So surveys at the beginning of the class, before, you know, when class starts, that they could submit a survey either online or a physical one where they could say what their pronoun is and things like that. So there's a lot of ways around it, yet there will be challenges, but I don't think it will be a reason for us to say, let's not do it then. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
can I make two quick comments? And I know we're running up against time. I wanted to follow up on something Jazmine said. So I'm a teacher trainer, and so I'm coming at it from the other side. But I think one thing that I always try to do is at the beginning of a course, I tell the class what my preferred pronouns are. And I say, if you have preferred pronouns, let me know. And that leaves it to a student to, in their own time, to come to me if they have preferred pronouns. But I think having the discussion is really important. Second, I wanted to just comment on is that there is some research that's emerging on the interaction, of validating somebody's gender identity in a foreign language classroom and the impact of that on actual second language learning. And there's some case studies of individuals who did not have their gender identities validated, were sort of forced to be treated in a particular way by a teacher, and the negative impact of that on their eventual language acquisition. So if you're looking also at, this is not just, some quibble over what somebody wants to be called. I mean, these have significant impacts on people's lives. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I'm glad you're raising this issue, Dylan.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know I gotta go, so thank you. Thank you guys so much for your questions.
We appreciate it. And then now we've got, it's just a little bit past 10:30. So Ramzi, apologies, but go ahead and share your slides and we'll listen to your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. I'll try not to go over, though I can't make any promises. So we'll go here. So wait, this is showing. All right. Wait for that to show up on mine. All right. So my presentation is done with help of my classmates in a course I took last semester, Early Tang and Jeff Johnson, who couldn't be here today. But I'll present it on their behalf. And we were interested in analyzing gender from a more theory neutral point of view than had previously been done in the computational linguistics literature. So quite often what happens is there are several metrics that one can collect about a certain set of texts. And then one compares texts of different genres according to these metrics, and we find differences and correlations across those metrics, which can be quite advanced metrics that use AI and deep learning, etc., or they can be quite superficial metrics, such as like vocabulary density. Generally, though, these genre analyses have also been done on a higher level of genre than we use in common parlance. So it's not necessarily the difference between sci-fi and horror, or mystery and teenage detective novels, whatever. But it is the difference between, for instance, newspaper writing versus research article writing. And those are places where you would expect to see very different formalisms that exist in the text. But we were more interested in trying to find some kind of metric that allowed us to make finer grained distinctions in texts that look similar, that theoretically should be using similar kinds of formalisms, but we understand to have a broad genre or thematic or stylistic particularity to them. And so that's why we chose sci-fi versus detective novels, especially because both of them were popular pulp fiction forms around the turn of the 20th century. So they existed in a common social context, despite their different thematic content, we'll say. And the technique that we wound up using was keyword analysis. So we'll go over what keyword analysis is. So a lot of the metrics that exist currently in computational linguistics rely on like natural language processing methods. And so these involve using AI to analyze either parts of speech of sentence or sentiment of a sentence, or getting the tone of some piece of text in general. What we wanted to do though was work more with content difference, so that involves actually the semantic content of words. So we turned to this mechanism called keyword analysis. Initially, there's a researcher called Kilgariff who thought that we could just look at word frequency differences between corpora, and that would tell us about the actual whether a corpus was sufficiently similar to another corpus if it had significant keyword differentiations. He wasn't necessarily interested in what those differences were, but that the differences could be measured such that corpora could be deemed sufficiently different or sufficiently similar to act as, like, say, reference corpora for each other. But Racine and Garside came along in 2000 and developed this log likelihood method, which is based on modifying the chi-squared test that does judge the differences in frequencies between texts. But what's nice about this log likelihood method is instead of just, say, judging two texts against each other by their word frequency, and having them need to be relatively statistically similar, this allows for, say, a reference corpus, which contains a lot of text that's very varied and relatively, we want to say, homogeneous to the whole of how language is spoken, can be compared to a specific text, and that specific text then can have its particularities drawn out by the keyword analysis. And we could go over the statistics, but I don't think anyone here cares that much. So why were we drawn to keyword analysis specifically? Well, we find that it has had some discoveries. So, for instance, here with Tribble's research in 1998, he looked at a corpus of romantic fiction and did keyword analysis on it. Found evidence to suggest that first and second pronouns were particularly prevalent, proper nouns, complex noun phases, which all of which imply spoken language. And so one can note that the stylistic formattings of romantic fiction contain elements of spoken language, which is a particular stylistic and contentful derivation of the text. And then you can also look at texts in a specific period of time. So, for instance, Johnson, Culpepper, and Sewer in 2003 studied British newspaper articles and wanted to see how tones and themes shifted across time. Noted that that discussion, for instance, around political correctness in 1994 shifted from the discussing a range of minority identities to specifically talking about racism in 1999. So we can see that this is very good at picking out these, like, very fine-grained distinctions as opposed to the maybe super level distinctions that we might talk about otherwise. So we looked at a lot of texts, or tried to get as wide a variety of texts as we possibly could. It's worth noting that if we were to go down all of these lists, all of the texts from these lists, they vary from about, the earliest text on here, I think, is from like the 1860s, and the latest text is, I think there's some on here from 1940, if I remember correctly. But we are spanning a wide scope of time, and we are spanning both the United States and the UK. So that's another complicating factor that we can discuss in the limitations. We did some preliminary research to see if we just applied it blindly to a corpus, what would happen. Interestingly, with our our first thought was to compare it to the Wikipedia corpus because, oh, that's written by a lot of speakers and it's very large. So it must have a variety of different text styles. But actually, what we found was almost every single list kept coming up with the content similarities between all the Wikipedia corpus. So regardless of being written by hundreds of thousands of different authors, they actually have a quite defined style. So we instead looked to the Brown corpus, which is a corpus from the 60s that tries to compile a whole bunch of different genres together. So we cleanse the text for processing just by tokenizing it. And we noticed as well that a lot of the words that would show up would be words like I, my, you, me, because these are the most common words in a text. And as well, they are just personal pronouns, for instance, are very indicative of fiction, especially fiction told from a first person point of view. So we wanted to be able to look at some of these because this is where there can be differences seen in keyword analysis. But we also wanted to be able to capture more content-based and thematic roles. So we did a what's in computational linguistics is filtering for function versus content words. Function words are most commonly auxiliary verbs, pronouns, common like quantifiers, determiners, etc. Trying to get rid of anything that would basically exist in any sentence everywhere. There's in the computational linguistics community, there's like a list of function words that are commonly excluded. And we developed a dictionary method in order to sort how the text got scored over time. So the way the log likelihood method works is it doesn't actually produce you'll notice here there's a bunch of numbers. These numbers don't mean anything in specific. They mean things relative to each other. So when comparing, for instance, Sherlock Holmes, this Sherlock Holmes novel, to the reference corpus, it's a score of 4,523. That doesn't mean anything unless you then look at Holmes, which it has, it's much higher than. So I is a more representative word in the Sherlock Holmes novel than Holmes is, for instance. So we wanted to get rid of these numbers and find a way of compiling them. So we developed a dictionary method, which basically turned the top, in various cases, 20 or 100 words of each of these lists into a basin, basically, let's say. So this is just getting more into how we actually programmed and the statistical modeling of the log likelihood method. Again, we don't super care, but it's just worth noting that that this is based on a probabilistic understanding of how things exist in a language because it's based on the chi-squared test. The problem is that language isn't naturally distributed like this, but this is why we only use the chi-squared scores relative to each other and not absolutely. Okay, and I think that's probably fine, and we can get into the actual analysis. Oh, and this is what I was talking about with the basin method, where, for instance, here, this mystery order took our 15 novels that we used from each genre and compiled the words that appeared, for instance, in the top 100 of the most representative words of each novel, and then compiled them across each of the texts. So, for instance, here, out of our, so actually this one uses 12, not 15, but whatever. Out of our 12 texts in this case, 8 of them had answered as one of the 100 most representative words in that list. 8 of them had state, 7 of them had cert, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, And another thing we wanted to do was also look at these content words based on their part of speech, which we'll get to later, the results. So in terms of the list that included function words, so these were the ones that included words like I, me, my, pronouns, etc. And we only looked at the top 20 most representative words from each of these texts. And we can notice that in mystery novels, a lot of different pronouns were selected as the most representative words. So I appears in 15 texts as most representative, me appears in 10, my, you, your, she, her, his, it, versus science fiction novels have all of the personal pronouns, but they don't have any of the relational pronouns. So they don't have he, her, he, she, him, etc. And the only other non-personal pronoun is you. And we can look at the distribution of that. Whereas in mystery novels, it appeared in 15 of the most representative lists. It only appeared in 3 of the most representative lists for science fiction novels. So there was some degradation of interrelationality between mystery novels to science fiction novels. On the other hand, in detective mystery novels, out of prepositional words, of and upon are the only prepositions we notice. So the physical relations that are being consistently expressed in mystery novels are not are less varied, let's say, versus we see that science fiction novels contain a lot of prepositional, some that are containment based, some that are physical relation based. So there was more of a tendency towards the description of physical spaces in science fiction novels versus more of a description of interrelational personal states in detective novels. In terms of looking at content words, we noted that for the differences in verbs that were quite prominent was that there were a lot more reporting verbs, or a lot wider variety of reporting verbs in detective mystery novels, as opposed to science fiction novels where it's just said, replied, state, versus we have a whole variety of trying to evoke emotive states of statement with the science fiction novels, with the mystery novels, sorry. We also can note then that in contrast to that, the science fiction novels had a wider variety of descriptive physical adjectives. So new, dead, mighty, green, thousand, frightful, awful, fierce, hideous, a lot of evocative imagery is used in the science fiction content words, as opposed to much less adjectival variety in the mystery novels. And so we can note that the keyword analysis actually does a pretty good job of finding these really fine-grained differences in relatively similar genres of text. It allows us to look at text on multiple axes, looking at both content differences and structural differences. It's worth noting here there was selection bias, so we didn't know what we were looking for. We just knew we were looking for something, and then we found something. But that's what makes this method a good method for looking at preliminary research conditions that can help us with hypothesis generation later on. As kind of stated before, the lack of second person pronouns, more prepositions, more visual adjectives show that maybe sci-fi can be said to be more introspective, but also more visual and relatively more simple, versus detective novels can be said to be more relational, more varied in human communication, but less interested in describing the exact physical world. And in general, the analysis shows that literary genre can encode writing style elements that would be more likely to appear as individual stylistic difference, which is why it's interesting that it's appearing across a variety of different texts. Oh, I missed our limitations. We glossed over quite a few things. Obviously, words are not just one thing. Words have polysemy. We completely ignored that. We tried to collect as wide a variety of different Englishes and collect them as possible. And we tried to collect as wide a variety of authors as possible. But this was obviously limited by the fact that certain authors are just much more prolific. So I think there's like 3 Ray Bradbury texts or something in the science fiction novels. And then we also didn't do any analysis of whether the texts themselves were internally homogeneous. So that is to say that you can say, because you've analyzed the whole text, you can say something about any specific part of the text. It might be the case that a text varies as you go throughout it. So I just wanted to acknowledge those. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I realized that we did go over time and right through your Q&A session, but I didn't want to interrupt your presentation. And we are at the break. So technically it is the break until 11 a.m. But if anybody wants to hang around and ask Ramzi some questions, that's fine too. But otherwise, there isn't going to be another presenter until 11 when Jazmine will present. So if anybody wants to chat with Ramzi, that's fine. Again, apologies for all of the very brief chunks of time. This is our student association's first time hosting a symposium, so we weren't quite sure how much time to allot for everything. So this is a learning process for us as well.
Sorry for going off.
We really appreciate you doing this, LLDSA, so no worries.
All right, thank you. Yes, but it is a break for now unless anybody wants to discuss anything with our last presenter. I will say I'll bring everybody back at 11. So if you just stay in the area, the Zoom, if we were in a classroom or a different room, I'm sure we'd all be up and walking around, but of course. Okay, it is 10:59, so I'm one. Oh, it's 11. Okay. All right. Welcome back, everybody, from that brief break. And without further ado, Jazmine, go ahead and get your slides, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, is that visible to everyone? Yes, okay, and it's not presenter view? No, okay, cool. All right, so hold on one second. Just let me move this out the way. And okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for opening up this call so other people outside of San Jose could come in and participate. So nice to meet you all. My name is Jazmine, and I am a fifth-year PhD candidate at the University of Santa Barbara in the Department of Linguistics. And so I'm very excited to be sharing some work that I've been working on for the past year with all of you. So the title of this talk is My Terms and Their Terms, Non-Latinx Spanish Language Learners Navigating Racio-Gendered Terminology and Discourses. And it's based on one of my dissertation chapters, which focuses on non-Latinx people navigating identity as they study Spanish. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, I'd just like to talk a bit about who I am and how my personal experiences shape the chapter that this presentation is based on. So my research uses sociolinguistic and anthropological theories primarily to study the intersections of embodiment, identity, and second language learning. And so to do so, I primarily rely on kind of ethnographic and autoethnographic methods, as well as critical descriptions of narratives and discourse. And so currently I live in central Mexico, and I've studied and taught and done research in Latin America, where I've been exposed to different discourses of race and identity that both overlap with and collide with US frameworks. And so when conceptualizing my dissertation, I began by writing an autoethnographic account of the various ways that my own body is read and defined racially in different Spanish-speaking contexts, both within and outside of the United States. And in that account, I discuss terms that have been ascribed to me by other people and the terms that I prefer for myself. And I have typically preferred, for instance, the term negra, Black woman, in Spanish to describe myself, because to me, I feel like it does the best job at capturing not only my racial identity, but also my ethnicity and my nationality as an African-American woman with over 7 generations of heritage from the US, at least on one side of my family. So while I have defined myself as negra in Colombia, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and in places in the US, when I moved to Mexico 2 years ago, I continue to experience the term negra or negro being used in discourses that are either very derogatory or foreign political discourse. And almost never in like a neutral way to describe one's identity. So instead of using negra, people would call me morena, which is a term that I believe captures my skin color as a dark-skinned woman, but does not capture my Afro descendants. However, I eventually had to adapt to that term morena and reject negra because referencing myself as negra seemed to be degrading in this context. So I decided to study this complexity of capturing racio-gendered identity for non-Latinx Spanish language learners. So the goal of this work is to identify and theorize challenges that learners have translating racio-gendered identity across linguistic, cultural, and national contexts. In addition to that, it also seeks to identify the strategies that learners use to navigate these challenges. And so this goal has been guided by 2 major research questions, which are here on the screen. So what strategies do Spanish learners, non-Latinx
Jazmine, we cannot see any of the questions. We only see the initial slide, just so you know.
Oh no, okay. Okay, so y'all see the slide, it's changed? No?
Oh, it is the same. Oh gosh, wow, we were missing out on all these great photos.
Oh, okay. And so are we here now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, Well, glad I said that. So it was not on your screen, but now it is. And so what are the strategies that non-Latinx Spanish learners use to capture their racio-gendered bodies in Spanish through terminology or linguistic practices? And how do their English speaking and or US lenses play a role in this process? So before I move on, I'd like to just briefly explain what I mean by racio-gendered and correspondingly racio-gendered terminology and racio-gendered linguistic practices. So racio-gendered is my way of talking about the simultaneous experience of being racialized and gendered, because my work does not see these constructs as being separable. And so racio-gendered terminology, therefore, will refer to terms that are used to refer to racialized indicators, namely, the pigment of skin, facial features, and other racially motivated bodily configurations or racially kind of associated bodily configurations, ethnic heritage, things like that. And in Spanish, these terms are always going to be gendered as well. So I'm called morena with an A and not moreno because I'm a dark-skinned woman. So in racio-gendered linguistic practices can refer to various ways that people use language that is associated with particular racio-gendered identities. So this could be anywhere from how certain ways of pronouncing things are associated with racialized and or gendered groups. It could also be discourse practices. So for example, like the discourse practice or discourse marker girl, like hey girl, bye girl, is often associated with Black women's language in the United States. Okay, right, next slide, research data. Okay, so when it comes to the data for this project, I decided to collect narratives through one-on-one interviews with Spanish learners who do not identify as Latinx. And so the interviews lasted about an hour, and I asked them a series of questions relating to their Spanish language learning journeys. So when we discussed identity, specifically race and gender, I asked them to recall specific interactions or encounters that they've either experienced or witnessed, and to kind of relive those and describe those with me. And instances of interest to the analysis were then pulled out and analyzed in relation to not only discourses in the overall interview, but also in relation to sort of larger societal, political or cultural discourses that, are contemporary, but also historical. And, okay. So my preliminary findings, so based on the analysis, I have so far been able to identify 3 major strategies that my participants use to navigate or capture the racio-gendered identity in Spanish. And these were rejection, adoption, or creation. And so given the interest of time, I'll only be able to talk about one of those today. So today I decided to talk about the strategy of rejection. So the rejection strategy refers to learners outright rejecting specific terminology or linguistic practices, either being used towards them or taking them on and using them for themselves. So in the interviews, learners talked about what the terms meant for them and how they collided with their own identities and ultimately decided to reject them. So as I looked further into rejection, I saw that there were many themes that contextualized why students rejected or used the rejection strategy. So one was confusion surrounding the social meaning of terms or linguistic practices. Others were like offense towards certain terminology or linguistic practices, and others was like general discomfort with certain terminology or linguistic practices. So for me, in my instance of, say, like rejecting negra in the context of Mexico has a lot to do with my confusion of the social meaning that the term evokes in this context. And I'll show you examples of all 3. So this first example comes from Jada, who's a Korean American woman and is an advanced Spanish learner. And Jada told me that when she is abroad in Spanish speaking nations, it's not uncommon for her to be called China, which means Chinese woman or girl, or even Chinita, which means the same thing, but just in the diminutive form. So before the discourse that's shown in this transcript, Jada told me that she has had overt conversations with Spanish speakers about these terms, and she's gotten mixed reviews. So some people say that, they're just terms of endearment, don't worry about it. And others have said, no, it's just a really problematic linguistic practice that I wish would leave. So she's just been really confused about this. And so Jada's reflection of these terms represents confusion of what they mean socially, and therefore how she should feel about them. So she says, it's something that I still grapple with. It's not like I think it's certainly a form of racialization. I just don't know what to make of it. Like I'm not going to be able to understand the intent behind that. And then she says, like, it always feels gendered and like low key, like also sexualized when people say like china or chinita. It's like the compounding of the racialization with the gendered piece that always feels really belittling to me. And I definitely gaslit myself like, oh, I'm being too sensitive, like someone with an American politics sensibility, like political sensibility. But I do think like every time that's happened, I mean, not every, but most of the time it's men. So primarily Jada rejects these terms because, one, she's not Chinese by ethnicity or nationality. However, based on how she has experienced these terms being used, she believes what is wrong about these terms is that they seem to function in a way to sexualize and belittle her. However, Jada's confusion continues on lines 14 through 17 as she expresses an awareness towards her lens as an English speaker from the US and how this lens might impact how she understands the linguistic practice of being called china or chinita. And because of this, she battles with imposing the norms from the US or English speakers onto Spanish speakers, but still sees her rejection as valid when she states that she gaslit herself by, saying that she was being too sensitive. So while I'm focused in this presentation to show you sort of my thematic analysis of the themes I've been able to pull, I also do a pretty in-depth descriptive analysis. And throughout the transcript, I bolded in red. We can see that Jada is constantly using self-reflexive language to index her own sentiments, her own perspectives, her own abilities, her own behavior when it comes to how she has come to understand and ultimately why she rejects these terms for herself. So I just don't know what to make of it. I'm not going to be able to understand it. It's belittling to me. I gaslit myself, right? So our next example is offense as a motivator for rejection. So in this example, I spoke with Drea, who's a young lady who is a Black Bahamian American and is a beginner Spanish learner. And I asked her to talk about terms she used in Spanish to identify herself racially. And we ended up talking about why she does not use the term negra or negro to refer to Black people because it reminds her of pre-emancipation American discourse. So she says, that's saying to me, I feel like it's saying Negro. And she says, like just saying negro or whatever, or just looking at that, even the Spanish way, it just doesn't, like I said, it just doesn't sit with me. Because to me, I'm thinking to myself, ooh, it's carrying back to slavery time, because that's what we were called. Honestly, Afro-Americana and the other one, I wouldn't mind. Why? Because it's not saying negro, and she laughs when she says that. So while negro is a direct translation of the term Black, which is a term that she identifies as in English, negro shares the same orthography or spelling and appears to be a cognate of the English word Negro, which is outdated language to refer to Black Americans during the Jim Crow era and other overtly oppressive eras in the United States. So in lines 18 to 21, Drea is responding to a question I asked her, which was her feelings towards other terms like Afrodescendente or Afroamericana, both of which she expressed favor towards us simply because to her, they don't evoke hateful discourses and sentiments that she feels are embedded in the term Negro or Negro. So like Jada, Drea also indexes herself several times throughout the transcript, describing the terminology and her personal sentiments towards it as going against herself. It's saying to me, I feel like it doesn't sit with me, and thinking to myself. And the last one is, discomfort as a motivator. So in this example, I spoke with a young man who is also Black Bahamian, who is taking beginner level Spanish courses. And the excerpts represented in this transcript stem from a discussion about people addressing him with the colloquial phrase papi, which translates to daddy in English. But papi in Spanish is commonly used among many Spanish-speaking men, especially from the Caribbean. It's sometimes associated with hip hop culture, but it's a colloquial phrase used among like young male groups, kind of like to say bro. It's also used by a lot of Spanish-speaking women, mainly in the Caribbean, but also around Latin America, to refer to younger men and maybe their sons or their nephews, but it's in a non-sexualized colloquial way and often endearing, right? So this is the way that it's kind of came up in this conversation. So Jordan recalled being in department stores and a bunch like different older Spanish speaking women would address him as papi to get his attention or something. And I asked him if a Spanish speaking man had ever said that to him. And if not, would he find it weird or confusing if they did? And he recalled a moment where that actually did happen. And he found it very strange, but mentions that he didn't feel like the guy was trying to come on to him or anything, because we know that saying papi in English kind of evokes a sexualized discourse, or daddy even. But you know, that the guy was just sort of kind of colloquially greeting him. I then asked if that was something that he could see himself adopting as a Spanish learner who was trying to become fluent, to which he says no and gives the following explanation. He says, to them, that might be a greeting. In my head, that's me saying, hey, daddy. And that don't feel right with me personally. And then he says, since I've already started off with English and that's what I grew up, bro, or whatever, I'd feel okay saying bro or mano, something more of that nature. And I say, uh-huh. And he says, but I wouldn't say papi, I wouldn't. So in lines 1 through 7, Jordan acknowledges that Spanish speakers may see this as a greeting, but that to him, in his mind, he does a literal translation to saying, hey, daddy, which feels strange to him as a non-Latinx English speaker, and instead prefers mano, which is short for hermano, which means brother in Spanish. So that's a term that he would see himself either creating or just implementing instead of adopting a practice that already exists. So interactional norms relating to gender and sexuality are also at play here, as Jordan does not mention at all ever in his interview that he felt uncomfortable when women would use this term to him. It was solely when men used it, it struck some sort of discomfort for him. And like the other participants, he also locates his embodied sentiments in his explanation as well. And this shows that he sees this term or this practice as conflicting to his personal embodied expression. So again, in my head, that's me saying, and that doesn't feel right with me personally, and I just wouldn't. So as a summary and just in summation, just want to say that I hope this talk has showed how autoethnographic inquiry through narrative collection is an excellent and much needed approach to exploring racio-gendered experiences in second language learning, specifically how learners come to gain meaning of racio-gendered terminology and practices that are dependent upon both local and global, as well as contemporary and historical discourses of race and gendered interactional norms. And autoethnography also recognizes the different ways that people who might share the same societal identities have different embodied experiences. So Drea and I have very different understandings of negra and our opinions on using that, despite both being Black women, and how learners' unique embodied experiences with navigating Spanish-speaking contexts shape the meanings that they associate with Spanish terminology and linguistic practices, and therefore why they reject terms that they find unfitting to their identity as they step into a second language. So I'd just like to close out with some questions for the audience if you can't think of any, and just one would be, what are some theoretical frameworks or concepts or analytical tools do you see to be useful with examining racio-gendered experiences and learning Spanish as a second language? And also, what role, if any, should Spanish language education play in helping students understand and navigate racio-gendered identity in Spanish and in the Spanish-speaking world? Thank you all so much for your attention, and I'll just end it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jazmine. And now, oh yeah, she has her, if you want to go back to that, you had your email if you wanted to welcome any additional discourse. And if anybody wants, we can also provide that if you're comfortable with it, Jazmine. It seems like you do want people to reach out to you.
Please do.
Okay. Okay. So you do have a couple of minutes for Q&A session. And I don't know if anybody has any questions. We have actually about 1 minute if anyone has anything.
I'm just going to unmute myself. This is fascinating. I think this is so interesting, and it's so complicated. I just wanted to share an experience of my own. My wife is from Sri Lanka, and when we go there, I am referred to with this address term Sudu Mahatya, which basically means white gentleman, and it makes me very uncomfortable. But everybody uses it, and they all tell me, "Oh, don't worry about it," except for me. it feels incredibly uncomfortable with this kind of colonial history and such. So it's such a complex topic. So I'm fascinated by it.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. No, honestly, those are the things I really like for people to express and talk about. And now it's not just the term itself. And it's like, does this capture me? And you feeling like I'm uncomfortable with this term because of why historical discourses that kind of bleed into contemporary discourses that I just don't want to continue to evoke with my presence. Thank you for that.
Hey, Jazmine, I'm just curious, have you had a chance since you've been traveling around to see, like in Mexico or wherever you're at, you know how in the US we're kind of encountering, you know, this issue in our public dialogue. And so we use they in place of, just to make gender neutrality.
Mhm.
Have you encountered some of these same changes in Spanish and the Spanish speaking countries that you have been working on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we see a lot in the United States context with the X kind of replacing that. And that has a long history, even in say like Black Muslim American discourse, right? This X kind of in place of things. But in Latin America, oftentimes you'll see the E standing in. So instead of like Latinx, it'll be Latine or Latines or something like that. So yeah, very much those discourses are happening too. And you should bet that there's a lot of pushback on that even locally between people who think it's ideologically not something that they're aligned with or politically something that they're not aligned with. So there's a lot of fight throughout Latin America too for the visibility of queer folks in the language.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions also. And that's why we do a symposium, right? Is to have this sort of discussion and get to hear what other people are working on. And now it is time for our guest speakers, who are Dr. Scott and Dr. Dave. There you are. And they are going to speak about some TESOL related topics. So go ahead. If you guys want to share, I know you, yes. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and first of all, I will just say that I'm flattered that we're being called guest presenters. I think that's giving us a little bit more credit than we deserve, but thank you. So I'm Scott Phillabaum. I'm a professor in the TESOL program at San Jose State University. Dave, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Yes, I'm Dave Malinowski. I'm also a professor at San Jose State in the TESOL program.
Yeah, and so our talk today is called Rethinking the Basic Grammar Course for TESOL and K-12 teachers. We're going to try and go through it somewhat quickly so we have time for discussion. But I just want you to take a second and look at some of the things on this sign, especially the rose bouquet for $19.99 and the garage sale. And then I went swimming. So these will come up as we go through the presentation. So both Dave and I teach a course here at San Jose State University, and I think there are several students several people here today who have either taken the course and maybe another faculty member who may have taught it at one point or another. And the course is called Patterns of English, Ling 107. And this is the catalog description, a description of the sound, word formation, sentence, semantic and discourse patterns of English, analysis of contemporary examples of spoken and written English, prerequisite written communication 1. And this is a prerequisite course for our master's degree in TESOL, but it's also taken by students across the university. So the demographics of those students have shifted quite a bit over the past decade. So I want to give you some numbers first of what this looks like. So in fall, the academic year 2000-2008, these are our numbers. We had 19 students who were MA-TESOL students, 5 students who were linguistics majors, 20 students who were CHAD majors, which is child and adolescent development. These are people studying primarily to be primary school teachers. 36 liberal studies students also tend to be people studying to be elementary school teachers, and 11 students from a variety of other majors. But you see, as we go from 2008 to this past fall, 2021, as many MA-TESOL programs across the state and across the country have suffered sort of declines in enrollment, we're now down to 3.45% MA-TESOL students. liberal studies up to 48%, Chad up to 34%. So we're now over 80% of the students enrolled in the class, students who are preparing to be elementary school teachers. So that's the background of what we're going to discuss today. So I'll let Dave talk some about the textbook and the dilemma that we see it posing for working with this new sort of student body.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you, Scott. This is a textbook that we've been using for quite a while, and we discussed whether or not to continue. That's part of our conversation here today. Systems in English Grammar by Peter Master, who this is somewhat of a local production here, written and published out of San Jose State. The sort of overview here of the text encapsulates some of the dilemma that Scott and I are here to talk with you about, where the text is designed for teachers, and yet, as we've tried to underline here in this slightly maroonish, I'm not sure what color it shows up on your screen, but the center part of that block, where it says its purpose is not to provide engaging methods for the teaching of grammar, but rather to provide a fundamental understanding of how grammar works. So there's this balancing act that goes on in the words about the textbook as to how much teaching, practical application type of a focus you might have versus how much of the quote unquote fundamental understanding it is designed to elicit. So it leads us to challenges that we try to encapsulate here, right? How do we treat this topic in a way that does justice to the interests and skills of students who might be coming from a teacher training background, but also those who might either be wanting or needing more specific development of knowledge in structures of language. And so you can review the bullet points right there too. We'll just move on to our next slide, I think. We've tried to address this this sort of two-part, two-directional system where we're looking at teaching some of the fundamentals, the systems, the structures of language, and also its pedagogical applications by integrating teaching-related applications throughout the course, although we move progressively through a series of topics that might look like a very sort of prescriptive grammar approach, right? Verbs and determiners and different parts of speech and pronunciation facets. We tried to incorporate things like the way we design our classroom activities, doing collaborative assignments, the way we run and design our tests, and an observation assignment that we'll share a little bit about in a second. So one of the techniques, and we'll just jump there onto this slide, thank you, Scott, is to try to incorporate interactive and even teaching or tutoring encounters as a fundamental way of having to engage with the text. And so here's an example that asks students to start developing or bringing up their schema, their background knowledge on their own tutoring experience as we begin to present the material in the text through various kinds of tutoring assignments. And so for an exercise like this, that has to do with question formation and the grammar of question formation. One of the things that I've done in the classroom face-to-face is have students do a lot of dialogue and role play in person. If we're on Zoom during distance learning, they might do it over Zoom and record it. And I even have an assignment where I've asked students to record a demo of themselves tutoring or teaching to the ether, which is a very difficult assignment, but is something that we often have to do, for instance, for a job application for a teaching position. Shall we look at the next one? And here's an example of materials creation. So this is another aspect. I've graciously received these two samples of pronunciation lessons that students have come up with. Carolyn Medina and Lali Mendoza, I want to say thank you. And to the right, on the right side, Natalia Casillas and Kevin Dip and Kesha Kraft came up with that common pronunciation problem for Korean speakers of English as one type of application activity that we try to incorporate in the class. Shall we look again at the next slide?
Next one is me, shall I? go on then, Dave?
Yes,
Yours
please.
is coming up in a second.
Please.
Okay, yes. So another project that we've developed, and this really was, this is my variation of the project that Dave put together, and he'll show you some of those later, but was to get students engaging with language outside the classroom, making observations about grammar and language use outside the classroom. So here's the long assignment explanation, but basically it's just make observations about things that you notice in your day-to-day activities, whatever they are. And I'm going to show you two of those that students have made, so you get a sense of that. This one, for anybody who used to watch The Office, you may be familiar with it. If you haven't, it's actually a really interesting one. This is a scene, I won't show it, from The Office, where Kevin decides that he's going to basically speak more efficiently by eliminating words from his language use. And the student makes this very perceptive observation that all of the words that Kevin cuts out are function words, right? And that he just speaks using content words. So again, this is one where you're sitting watching a TV show, just being amused by the show itself, and you begin to see this connection between that and the real world. Here's one that I found really fascinating from a student whose grandparents had immigrated to the US from China, and she actually found one of her grandmother's old English books, English Pronunciation by Robert Lotto and Charles Fries, right? This is a classic, actually. But she opened it up and started looking through it and saw, oh, how interesting. Look, these are things that we're talking about in my Linguistics 107 class, and these are the same things that my grandmother completed 60 years ago. So again, making connections between some of what we're talking about and the real world. Dave, this is you. Shall I go to the web to show them this? And you've
I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll just mention that I've been having students engage via Twitter over the course of the semester with a weekly prompt to tweet and interact with each other, and retweet and comment on content that they're finding online, but also to generate an in-class discussion about weekly topics, merging grammar topics with the real world's language they're seeing and hearing around them. And it's an experiment in progress, and similar to Jazmine, I'll just stop by asking for soliciting some input if anybody would like to speak back and have a chance to look over that work and give some input as to your thoughts about how that assignment might work in your context, or any questions it might raise using social media. And as Scott was pointing out earlier, a platform that was just bought by Elon Musk for our Twitter assignment going forward is something I definitely have some second thoughts about now. But overall, I find it to be very successful and interesting, and worth really looking to in the future. So you can scroll down through that Adobe page there and just get a sense of what the assignment might look like in my class. And again, please do send some thoughts my way if you have any of critical or any other kinds of questions about it.
This is still you, Dave, I think, but I.
Well, let me keep talking, because we sure do have challenges. One of the difficulties that we've experienced as we try to teach a certain amount of content and provide a wide scope of different topics within English grammar and pronunciation is that there is just no time. Even though we benefit from the semester as opposed to the quarter system, it runs out so quickly. And after balancing between the grammatical content and application activities of various sorts, we really struggle to both provide the depth of grammatical knowledge and ability to process and work through some of the mechanics of language, this is a very rare opportunity in a class like this to actually talk about these things and work through them, and also to feel like we're doing justice to their application. And trying to do tutoring exercises and outside observations and so on leaves us both saying the same thing that's right there in the middle bullet point. I'm so far behind in terms of content coverage. And we're also wondering the question if we're really just trying to, make the class more engaging and fun, and how much of the types of applied activities actually help intersect with the deepening of and sort of cross-fertilization of different kinds of knowing and doing of grammar and pronunciation that can be done in the classroom. So we can move forward here, I think, and wrap up in a sec.
Yeah,
So yeah, go ahead and sorry, Scott.
Yeah, I'll go through this one real quick and then bring us to the sharing. Yeah, so some questions that we continue to grapple with is, how can we guide students towards good pedagogy when they lack adequate content knowledge? They need to know the grammar to serve their students, but they also need to know how to teach it. So how do we do that? Second, getting back to that quote that we had underlined from the book, is it our responsibility in this class to actually teach teaching, or are we there to teach them the content? And of course, this is for all of our classes. How can we encourage students to play a greater role in their own learning? And that's what we're trying to do with some of these activities, getting them to be more active in their own learning of the content by making connections outside to the world. So these are our sharing questions we'll put up there, and maybe just open it up to any comments or questions, suggestions.
And thank you for the presentation. I actually am a student who took this class, and it looks like Nicole has got her hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi there. I just wanted to share my experience as one of those liberal studies major teacher prep students. And I actually took this course with Dr. Scott. And especially in the beginning of the course, I found that there was such a gap in between the knowledge that I had about grammar and this related content and trying to come up with different pedagogical approaches. And I found that the activities actually did help, because a lot of times when coming up with some sort of teaching method or way to teach this pronunciation or grammar, you often look at it from like a native speaker perspective as opposed to a learner's perspective. And so I found that a lot of these activities, they were fun, but they also really, really did help me figure out how to come at things from a more pedagogical approach and provide a lesson that would really benefit the learner.
Thank you, Nicole. That's really wonderful to hear.
All right, we've got a few spare minutes before we wrap up the symposium, but if anybody has any questions or if you'd like to share your own response to the questions that are on the shared screen right now, feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you.
I'd just like to say something as well, just to complete what Nicole said. I was also a student at Professor Scott Phillabaum classroom, and although he did not explicitly taught me how to teach, right? One big lesson that I've learned from on all the activities that he provided to us from this book is to focus on our students' assertiveness instead of their errors or mistakes. And I also like the part that if we look into our learners' mistakes and where they come from, that which are based most of the time related to their first language knowledge, so we might be able to help them better. Yes, thank you for everything.
Thank you.
It's a really great point. And this conversation with you, Nicole and Flavia, and your comments, Stephanie, in the chat also just made me think in a larger context about the event that we're all sitting here a part of, where you have talks from different aspects of linguistics that, different areas that might not talk to each other very often in many other contexts. And I just want to really say that, our dilemma in this course is maybe a similar kind of a dilemma in one sense, but also a real gift in bringing together students and scholars who are and teachers who are part of very different discourses in their various places on our campus or across the state or further afield. And I think it's really exciting and maybe a responsibility that we might have at this point in history to really make ourselves reach out beyond the sort of traditional or typical spaces that a lot of us, generate meaning and such for our ideas. We really benefit from this challenge. I do as a teacher, and I benefit from the dialogue that events like this have brought together as well across fields and subfields and disciplines and so on. So thank you, and it's all very stimulating.
Thank you.
And just one quick comment also about that's to Professor David. According to our discussion, right, when you bring your class to the Twitter, right? I was analyzing. I think you might find it in the journal that I have written for this week. So if we think about grammar being taught explicitly nowadays in the classrooms, right? And when we also consider the social aspects of language, right, that we cannot get rid of, it is important to provide that for our students. So as we normally do not have time to provide social interactive activities sometimes in the classroom, when you do that, Professor David, like bringing to student social context, in student social media, which is the place that most of them are connecting and talking, right, most of the time, I believe we are completing the cognitive part of the instruction together with the socialization. So it kind of helps the students in all ways of cognitive development. I am not sure again if I was able to express myself well, but I hopefully you understood. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic to have like you said, not all of these areas of linguistics necessarily always talk to each other. So it's great to have everybody here in one place where we can, and you can kind of get to know what's going on in this area. Computational linguistics versus TESOL are very, very, they're still in the same branch of study, but they're quite separate areas based on what they cover and what they investigate. So it's great that that we had such varied presentations. And I want to thank everybody again, our presenters, and also everybody who attended. And of course, thank you to Fong as well, who is here still, and our other officers who couldn't be here, but were extremely instrumental in making this happen. Yes, applause. Thank you so much, everybody. We have a couple extra minutes. I'll leave the room open until 11:45, but that concludes our symposium. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful presentations, really interesting talks.